Hey everyone, Trev here with the Darkroom. So, have you ever heard someone say they pushed or they pulled their film and you had no clue what they meant? Or say you have a good idea, you just want to learn more? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain what it is, when, why, and how to best do it. So, first off, a push and a pull, they happen in development. Say you hear someone say they took their 400 ISO film and pushed or pulled it to whatever ISO, but they didn't get it developed differently. That's not a push or a pull, it's just an under or an overexposure. It happens in development. And I'm going to explain it first with pulling, which is a lot less common than pushing. So say you have 400 ISO film and you intentionally or accidentally shot it at 200 ISO. If you were to get that developed normally, it would be a one-stop overexposure. Now, color negative and black and white film can typically handle it, and we would just usually recommend not getting it pulled, get it developed normally, and it will handle that overexposure no problem and look great. But say for this example, you want to even out that exposure. You would have to have it pulled one stop in development. A pull is an underexposure, typically compensating for an overexposure. So if you were to shoot 400 ISO at 200 ISO and you're making an order at the darkroom.com or with our mobile app, you would select push and pull processing and select the -1. You would select that and then you would write -1 on the roll itself with a Sharpie, so when it gets in our lab, we know which roll to pull. And here at the Darkroom, we are a traditional dip and dunk lab that develops E6 slide film, C41 color negative, and black and white in dip and dunk. And dip and dunk allows us to change the development times, allowing us to push and pull film. Now, pushing is the opposite of pulling. It is an overexposure, typically compensating for an underexposure. So say you have 400 ISO film and you accidentally or intentionally shot it at 800 ISO. If you were to get that developed normally, that would be a one-stop underexposure, which could result in darker images, more noticeable grain, muddy, not so good looking images. So you definitely want to compensate, push one stop in development. So when you're making an order, you would select push and pull processing and select +1, and then you would write +1 on that roll. Or if it's +2, you'd write +2. Whatever the push is, you'd have to write it on the roll as well as select that in processing so we know which one to push or pull. Now, when it comes to the results of pulling and pushing, they are opposite as well. Pulling typically reduces your contrast, which will oftentimes result in better shadow detail and better highlight detail. So say you're photographing a very high contrast scene, pulling could help reduce that contrast, give you better shadow, better highlight detail, but it can oftentimes, depending on the film, make your photos very flat. Pulling is a lot more common too with black and white. If you were to pull color negative film, it will not only reduce your contrast, but sometimes it will also mute your colors, changing the look of the film. In general, it's not that common to pull film, especially color film. But when it comes to pushing film, it again has the opposite effect. Instead of reducing contrast, it typically increases contrast. When you increase contrast, depending on your light, depending on the film, it can reduce shadow detail and it can make your highlights go a little bit hotter. But that depends on the film. Some film handles pushing better than others do. For instance, my favorite black and white film to push is HP5. Ilford's HP5 Plus is a 400 ISO black and white film, and it's known for its lower contrast. So if I'm photographing a high contrast scene, I'll just shoot it at box speed at 400 ISO, and it helps handle those bright highlights and still gives me good shadow detail. But say I am taking photos in lower light and I am shooting at too slow of a shutter speed, which might result in shaky images, and I don't have a fast enough lens, or say I don't want to use a tripod, I want an extra stop or two of light in my metering, I could do that by increasing my ISO. So say I have Ilford HP5 Plus 400, I could shoot it at 800 ISO, and that will give me one extra stop of light when I'm metering. So that will allow me to take photos in lower light, and then when I get it developed, I'll have it push to stop, and that will even out the exposure. Now, a push will increase the contrast. And sometimes for HP5, that looks really good. You know, if you like more contrast, and since it's already a lower contrast film, it handles a 1 or 2 stop push pretty easily. In fact, I pretty much always shoot HP5 at 800. It's pretty much the main way I've shot it for the past couple of years. It's just, in my opinion, looks better. And that's on the creative side. Cine still film is the most commonly pushed color film. There's 400D and 50D. And the most commonly pushed is the 800T because it's just a very versatile film. It looks really good almost however you shoot it. If there's good light, I will shoot it at 800 or lower. Sometimes I even shoot it at 400 and get it developed normally, and it just handles it really well. But say I'm in low light and it's dark and I want an extra stop or two, I could push it 1 or 2 stops and that film will handle it very well. The only thing that you have to keep in mind when pushing color negative film is that oftentimes when you increase the contrast, it can increase saturation, obviously reducing shadow detail and highlight detail on occasion, and certain film pushes better than others. Cine still film pushes really well, but there's some film, if it's already known for high contrast and known for high saturation, like say Ektar, and you don't like high contrast or high saturation, pushing it wouldn't be the best idea because it's only going to increase that. Now, say you are relatively new to film and you are learning, we don't recommend pulling or pushing. We recommend box speed. It is best to learn at box speed. Most film still will perform best at box speed. It's designed to shoot at its box speed. And by box speed, I mean if you have 400 ISO, it's best to shoot it at 400 ISO. And if you want it brighter, you just do that by metering brighter. Now, there are certain types of film cameras that can push and pull. If you have a camera that doesn't allow you to select the ISO, we typically don't recommend pushing or pulling because you can't control the exposure. If you cannot control the exposure, you probably shouldn't be pushing or pulling. But if you have a camera that allows you to change the ISO, then you can push or pull film. So if you have 400 ISO film, you would set it to a higher ISO, 800 or 1600, and then push accordingly. One thing to keep in mind though is that it is very easy to underexpose your film when pushing. And that sounds obvious because you're already underexposing it and then overexposing it in processing. But say I have 400 ISO film and I'm shooting it at 800. It's HP5 black and white. And I point that at something bright white like snow. And I'm metering it as 800 ISO, and I underexpose it by 2 stops because my meter meters for middle gray, and it makes that white middle gray. Even though I push it in development, once I get my scans back, that could be even more underexposed, and with that added contrast, it will make that even more obvious. So that's something to keep in mind. When you are pushing film, you still want to err on overexposure. You still need to strive to have the best possible exposure. And that's why when we recommend pushing, we recommend at least putting a few rolls through at box speed and learning how your camera meters and learning how that film responds to certain lighting scenarios before you push. Now, when it comes to what types of film push best, I talked about this a little bit. You know, we can push slide film. It's actually pushes surprisingly well. But again, you need to know your metering very well because slide film has low exposure latitude. So if you do mess up on that exposure, the push will only emphasize that more. And then when it comes to color negative film, it just depends. It all comes down to what you like, the look of your film. Some film, like I said, won't push as well. Personally, I don't like pushing film that has high saturation. Like I don't like pushing Ultramax 400. I don't like pushing Phoenix 200 or Ektar 100 because they're known for higher saturation and sometimes higher contrast, and that's only going to emphasize that. Say you like that look, then go ahead. It's, you can do that. But I typically, if I'm going to push a film, it's typically going to be a cine still film. And when it comes to black and white, you also have to consider the look of the film as well. Some film, like I said, has higher contrast than others. For instance, Tri-X it is known for having higher contrast than HP5. So me personally, I don't push Tri-X as much. I typically shoot it at box speed because it has nice contrast at box speed and it works for me. But some people like higher contrast, so they will push it a stop or two. It just comes down to your preference. And one other thing to consider is with black and white film, you have the options of Ilford's Delta 3200 and Kodak's T-Max P3200. So say you do need extra light and you don't want to worry about pushing or pulling, you could always shoot one of those films, which will give you an extra couple stops of light over a normal 400 ISO film. And if you want to learn more about pushing and pulling film, see more examples of both, click the link in our description. And also, just if you have any other questions, let us know in the comments below. Send us a message. We would love to help.